Welcome to Elephanta Insights. If you are interested in understanding world politics in a deeper and more serious way, this space is designed for you. Here, we go beyond headlines and short-term news cycles to examine the ideas, institutions, strategies, and historical forces that shape international relations. Our focus is on clarity, depth, and thoughtful analysis. Today, we are building the ultimate conceptual scaffold for understanding international relations. Think of this as your advanced master-level explainer of the field. Before we even think about diving into the deep end of complex theories like realism or constructivism, we need to get our bearings. What exactly is this field? Why do scholars argue so intensely over its very definition? And how is it fundamentally different from political science? Well, let's figure that out together. Here is our roadmap for this session. We'll start by defining international relations, map out the discipline's boundaries, contrast it directly with political science, dig into theory as practical discourse, and finally, point ourselves toward the broader international system. Alright, let's jump straight into part 1, defining international relations. When you look at the traditional definition of the field, what's genuinely fascinating is that it places the sovereign state and its endless quest for physical security at the absolute center of the universe. In this classic view, the world is essentially a giant self-help system. Force is always a looming possibility, which makes the state the supreme undisputed actor. But hold on a second. Contrast that with a more globalist definition. This perspective argues that worldwide interconnectedness, things like global networks and cross-border transactions, are just as vital as traditional state diplomacy. It looks at the world holistically, seeing a web of connections rather than just a chessboard of competing states. This debate perfectly illustrates a massive conceptual insights. As the scholar Chris Brown points out, international relations isn't a physical object you can just stumble over in the real world. It doesn't have an essential existence. Instead, the way we define the field is entirely a matter of convention. It's a choice made by scholars. Why does this matter? Well, because definitions are inherently contested, and the definition you choose literally dictates what you study. If you adopt a strict state-centric view, you privilege governments, and you completely marginalize other actors like non-governmental organizations or transnational movements. How we frame the world shapes exactly what we see in it. Which brings us right to part 2, the discipline's boundaries. Now, this whole academic field didn't just appear out of thin air. It's historically situated. It emerged right alongside history, international law, and political science, heavily driven by the theoretical discourse of the state back in the late 1800s. Early scholars were basically obsessed with charting the borders of the modern state. Historically, scholars drew a very strict line in the sand. Inside that boundary, you have your domestic affairs, your internal governance, your local politics. Outside of it, you have external affairs and diplomatic relations. This inside versus outside dichotomy became the absolute organizing principle for the early days of the discipline. But as we all know, our modern world is incredibly interconnected. That strict line in the sand, it's constantly being washed away. Globalization continuously challenges those traditional boundaries. It localizes global politics and globalizes local politics, meaning a decision made in one part of the world can instantly impact a community thousands of miles away. Okay, moving on to part 3, international relations versus political science. This is a really crucial distinction to wrap your head around. Political science traditionally commonly deals with hierarchical centralized authority. It studies what happens when there is a government in charge. International relations deals with the exact opposite. It looks at external interactions where there is absolutely no supreme authority calling the shots. This gets to the very bedrock of our field. As historian Brian C. Schmidt notes, international relations is fundamentally structured by the political discourse of anarchy. Think about it. Sovereignty has a dual nature. Internally, a state has supreme political and legal authority. But externally, there is no higher central authority above the state. That absence of a global boss, that is anarchy. The study international relations literally picks up right where domestic sovereignty drops off. The discipline differentiated itself by choosing to focus entirely on this massive enigma. How do political interactions even work in a completely anarchic space? Let's dig deeper into how we study those interactions in Part 4, Theory as Practical Discourse. We humans love to put things in neat little boxes, right? We often try to neatly segregate empirical theory, meaning what the world is actually like, from normative theory, meaning what the world ought to be like. But in international relations, trying to keep these two completely separated is just unsustainable. It really doesn't help us. The legendary scholar H. Carr put it brilliantly when he said that utopia and reality are two facets of the same coin. Neither unadulterated realism nor pure your idealism can sustain the discipline on its own. Without idealism, realism lacks purpose. But without realism, idealism is just naive. Both absolutely must have their place. Ultimately, as scholars Ruiz Smith and Snowdile highlight, all of these theories are essentially practical discourse animated by one overarching question: how should we act? Because realistically, you can't decide how to act without understanding both the empirical reality of the messy world we live in and your normative goals for how to make it better. Finally, this brings us to Part 5, Toward the International System. To truly understand the international system, Hedley Bull gives us this fantastic way to think about order. He shifts our focus away from just random patterns of behavior and points us toward purpose of arrangements. Order, in this sense, is an arrangement of social life that actually promotes elementary universal goals. He boils it down to three totally foundational things required for any social life to function: security against violence, the keeping of promises, and the stability of possession. Basically, life, truth, and property. Without these three things, you couldn't even call a group of entities a society in the first place. But here's the catch. In a domestic society, you have a central government and a police force to enforce those rules. In world politics, those exact same goals must somehow be sustained by a society of states that is operating entirely under conditions of anarchy. There's no global mind one you can call, which leaves us with one incredibly profound structural reality to ponder. If international relations is the study of politics where domestic sovereignty ends and there is absolutely no global supreme authority, how on earth does states actually survive? The pure chaos of anarchy? Well, that is the exact puzzle we'll be solving as we turn to the state, sovereignty, and the mechanics of the international system in our next video. The purpose of this channel is not only to explain what is happening, but also to help you understand why it is happening and how it fits into the larger structure of world politics. If you find this video valuable, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel and stay connected with the series.